Hello and welcome back to our recordings on the 15 chapters of American government that we'll be having for our exams and our midterm exams and our final. This is for both the full semester online class and the second semester online class. So we're almost halfway through the recordings, and of course I do have old recordings of these chapters that were recorded over the summer that can be very useful for you as well. But there's a few updates in the new recordings that we have here. And so this is Chapter 7, the media. This will be part of our second midterm exam that will cover Chapters 6 through 10. Here we have from our third President of the United States and also the key author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, the importance of newspapers, and perhaps in our time, the importance of news blogs. And were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. So we can see here from Jefferson how important newspapers are to be able to keep the government honest, to be able to bring out information, to let people be informed on what are the best choices for their life and for their society. So if newspapers are able to be unfettered and do their job, Jefferson firmly believes it's going to create a better society, better opportunity for most people. The importance of newspapers, the importance of the news. But there's a responsibility as well. So what should be covered? And so if you've been following the Edward Snowden case, and I would urge you to at least Google that, get some working knowledge of this. If the government in secret are carrying out operations that are in violation of the Constitution, someone believes that they're in violation of the Constitution, what is the moral obligation at that point? Even though someone has a responsibility to maintain the secrets, what if the secrets are actually in violation of the essence of this country? And so that's the dilemma that Snowden was faced with. He didn't find it to be a dilemma. But he did break the law, and so that's why he doesn't live in the United States currently. So there we can look at the issues of the media. What can they cover? To what degree should they cover these events? What's the most important stories that we, the public, should be aware of and should have access to? It's an ongoing issue. Some of the images might be somewhat disturbing. In your left-hand corner here, you have a victim of the Las Vegas shooting. When there is a mass killing, how much should the public be aware of this? How much information, how many visual scenes should they be able to see and have access to? So there were over 60 people killed in the Las Vegas shooting. Should there not be some images of this? But these are people's loved ones. So do they have an expected right to privacy as well? So what should be shown? But what is newsworthy? Is vaping, while it has now created a health issue for some people, and it has taken the lives of some people, is it worthy of the amount of coverage that it's getting? When one story is being covered, does it mean that other stories are not going to be covered to the same degree, or some stories may not be covered at all? So there we can see a major part of the debate within news organizations to decide what should be shown and what is newsworthy. But we also have thrown into the mix, in the United States at least, the reality that almost all of our news organizations do need to sell advertisement. And in fact, that's how they make their money. That's how they stay in existence for the most part. It's not really through subscribers, but through advertisement. And if that's the case, or in the case of public media, that they get primary donations, which could be individual donors, but also in large part corporate donors. So do you have to then be mindful of what the corporate donors may want or the major purchasers of advertisement. And as a result of that, we may end up with not straight news information, but instead a mixture of information and entertainment. And in large part, one of the big complaints about news in the United States is it's primarily focused on opinion rather than straight out news. But is that what the advertisers are wanting? And that is what will sell more advertisement, get more people to watch, and get people to buy ads on a program. So there we can see this issue of infotainment, a mixture of information and entertainment. And indeed, almost all of our news is controlled by a mass media. That, in other words, it's part of a major, well, beyond just the term mass media, who controls the mass media. To be more specific, that you're generally looking at corporations that are owning that. And so either through their advertisement or their outright purchase of segments of the mass media, newspapers, books, television, radio, and now, of course, increasingly looking at an online media that would be using the computer and the internet. And so in all those areas, either it's purchased by major corporations or the advertisers support from corporations support these activities, these media activities. So here, when we look at big media, you'll see media monopoly on page 260. I'll just would urge you perhaps to pause the screen here and look over these major corporations and the power that they have. So no doubt it is big business, as we can see here with the media. And so if you were not part of one of these major corporations, the ability to be able to break into the system is pretty difficult. So page 260, media monopoly, and here you're looking at the major corporations that own major segments of the media. So you could pause that if you'd like, look it over a little bit more. I'm going to move on. Technology has clearly changed the structure of reporting. It's changed the workforce, and I think we're probably aware of that. But just to give you a couple of one really good example, both major newspapers in Chicago, and this has been several years now, Chicago Sun-Times, and then the other one is the Chicago Tribune. Maybe some of you are from the upper Midwest and you know of these two dominant newspapers. Well, they used to bring out on a job a reporter and a photographer by and large. In large part, that's what they would have in most cases. They have now they laid off all of the photographers, and the reason for that is that they could, through the use of smartphones and other devices, reporters could take the pictures on their own, or they could purchase, the two newspapers could purchase photographs from bystanders that may have taken pictures. Now, there's an immediacy of these pictures, and we can see the reasons for doing that. But are you getting the same type of image and emotion that's being captured by just having a reporter do this, who's also focusing on writing the story, or the bystanders? These two newspapers, by and large, believe that was the case. So we can see here the use of technology has changed some of the style and structure of reporting. But we can see here with people having their own phones and the ability to capture an event, record an event, or just take photographs of an event, it really does give the opportunity for citizen journalism, which you can read about in your text. And this is capturing an event of a protest in a California university, a protest of an increase of tuition. Students were protesting, and a police officer was brought in to break it up, and he was successful ultimately at breaking it up by using pepper spray. So he's been known in the on the internet as the pepper spray cop, and he's become a meme. And you're probably somewhat familiar with the term meme. Some of you far more than others, of course. Maybe you've actually participated in creating memes. Get an image, copy it, alter it, and then you put it through the internet and get more people to follow it. And so the pepper spray cop, just think of that image that you saw there. And now his image is out there, and lots of different memes. You can just, if you would want to, you can just go online and type in pepper spray cop and just see what you get. And there's some really funny ones, like this one with My Little Pony. But it does open up the question about our activities in public, whether we knew that we were really in public or not. Is it any time that we're outside of our homes in a public event, if our image is captured in the media, can it now turn into a meme? Do we have any control over this? So sports fans, for example, if they're now getting their image captured over either a happy ending or one that's not so happy, should it be available to the public to be able to use for their own devices? Do you have no control over that? Like this student here, this fan of Michigan, being quite stunned by the outcome of a football game. Is it now at this point he just showed a very human emotion, and he's now part of someone else's meme? And I'm throwing that out there because I do not know the answer. Does it mean that you're not in control of your image if you are in the public? And it seems to appear right now that yes, that is the answer. You are not in control. You are not in control of how other people are able to portray you when you are in the public. Well, let's go down memory lane here in history about the media and some of the changes that have occurred. So, I mean, we can see where we are right now, that someone takes a picture of you on the phone and now you become a meme for the internet. How did we get to that point? Well, we can go back to the partisan press, where it was certainly nothing like that occurring, but someone could write about you in the newspaper, and it took a lot of work to put everything together, and that was the beginning history of the media in the United States, the partisan press. In the 1780s, for example, in the early stages of the American government, and you literally would have people pressing down the newspaper. So you'd have a paper, and then you would put all the blocks together, you'd put ink on those blocks and press it down. Real work involved in just putting the news out. And at that point, it didn't make a whole lot of sense economically for individuals to buy newspapers and try to make a profit off of that. So that's the reason why it's called the partisan press, for a good stage of American history in the early part of the Republic. Roughly from the 1780s to, let's say, the 1830s, you would have political parties that would primarily own the newspapers, and they weren't really there with the intent of making a profit. Their main goal was to spread information or disinformation about their opponents and their own candidates. And so that's important to keep in mind if you're ever doing research and you're reading a newspaper from the 1780s. It may very well provide good information, but it could also provide information that is clearly biased for one party over the other. This starts to change with technology. Just consider some of the changes in technology in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, in the 20 some odd year period. The telegraph, the railroad, steam power, new changes in putting together the press, And so you could crank out more newspapers in a very fast period of time. More people were able to read newspapers. People had access to public education. And so with all that going on, you start to see competition among the newspapers in the major cities. Not unheard of for many newspapers to exist in several cities. New York City by the 1880s would have had 10 to 13 or so daily newspapers in New York City. So you would have had then a lot of street urchin children, as we can see here, at least a depiction of those kids that would go out and sell newspapers. And that's how they would make their living and be able to continue to survive by working for a newspaper and selling those papers. And so the penny press, very affordable newspapers in which people would have access to that form of the media. But one of the results of the penny press is yellow journalism, where the newspapers are trying to get a story out there and get people to buy their newspaper when the truth is not really focused on in the paper. It's not to say that it's an outright created story, but it is that there's a lot of holes in the story, and a process of filling in those holes. The newspaper is taking a lot of liberalities in how they report that story. So journalistic sensationalism, as we can see there. So a lot of speculation in these papers, exaggerations of cases, and that's why it's referred to as yellow journalism. It's believed that the name yellow journalism comes from a newspaper that first had colored cartoons, and one of the main cartoons was this one here called the Yellow Kid, and there's a depiction there of the Yellow Kid. It's also believed that perhaps yellow journalism comes from the cheap wood pulp that was used by some of the newspapers that didn't have a whole lot of capital, and so their papers would start to yellow faster as a result, and so they were perhaps more likely to not stick by any type of journalist integrity, and so their papers would be yellow faster, and so they would also perhaps call them yellow journalism. And yellow journalism had a lot of impact in our overall history here in the United States. The Spanish-American War in the late 1890s, it's firmly believed that it started by a buildup of newspapers that were encouraging activity in Spain that was still covering colonies in the Caribbean, like Puerto Rico and Cuba, and that the United States should be involved in that war, especially after the battleship the Maine exploded and killed several sailors and Marines. Later on, it was determined that this explosion was a result of faulty equipment and within the ship, but so it was not a torpedo from Spain. But the reporting of many major newspapers led a war fever in this country to do something about Spain, and so we had the war with Spain in the late 1890s. These were a couple of very powerful newspaper men who led the charge in their reporting to get the country involved in this war. And it is worth noting that the Spanish-American War was the time in which the United States started to emerge as a power in the world. And so yellow journalism had a big impact in changing the foreign policy of the United States. If you want to know more about the life of William Randolph Hearst, it's vaguely depicted, maybe not so vague, in one of the better known and artistic creations of cinema, film called Citizen Kane. And it's very important to watch this if you appreciate cinema. It would be worth your while to review this film. And so William Randolph Hearst, there's a lot of connections to his life and his behaviors in this film, Citizen Kane. Well, let's talk about some other examples of what the media might have a tendency to do. And these are some of the examples I'm going to give you here are not found in the text, so just in a way be aware of that. So pack journalism, the tendency for the press to cover the same stories. So you can certainly see that here in the case of how the media would, in the case of O.J. Simpson, which is now over 20 years old, but the situation there of many newspapers and television channels having the attitude that they need to cover this story because somebody else is covering it. And so then, just like a pack, the media is all covering this same story and perhaps overlooking some very important stories at that time. So that's some of the behavior that we can see there of the media. We can certainly see this in a campaign era. We can see the media covering horse race journalism. So there you can see the media covering who is ahead and who's behind in a campaign. And while there's a lot of criticism of horse race journalism, I think we can also see some importance of it. If you're a potential voter or donor, you may want to know if a candidate has some capabilities of winning a race, or maybe you also feel that you need to step up if somebody's falling behind in a campaign. So reporting on polling, reporting on the opinions of people who are following campaigns, that's what we can see with horse race journalism. And we are now we're roughly 11 months away, a little over 11 months away from another presidential election. So we can see that that's coming up here very soon. And so how candidates are doing becomes a very important part of journalism. Also along the issues of campaigns is the power of the media determining who gets to participate in a campaign. And so the fact of covering one candidate over another serves as a gatekeeper, and a gatekeeper can be like a bouncer, which is what these individuals are here, a bouncer of a nightclub. Who gets to be in the nightclub, who doesn't? Well, who gets to be on a debate stage and who doesn't? It may be the parties that are covering that, but perhaps how candidates are covered by the media will first begin the process of determining who will be able to participate. And so the power of the media is certainly on display when you look at how candidates are covered. So it was clearly the power of the Democratic Party itself to determine who would be able to be on the debate stage. So in the summer we had a debate in which there were over 20 candidates that did qualify for the debate. And so they had on 2 separate days. Maybe some of you watched some of that, or maybe all of it if you're really following these campaigns. So he had 2 separate days of the debates in both June and July. And you couldn't get all the candidates on the stage. Well, the media didn't make that determination who would be on there, but the media then did make the determination on whether they would cover candidates that didn't make the debate. And then the media also had the power of referencing how well or how poorly some candidates may have done in the debate. So there we can see the power of the media. So the qualifications are within the control of the political party, and we'll be covering political parties when we get to chapter 9. But in the summers, we can see the threshold was not too demanding, although it was still too much of a threshold for 6 of the candidates that I believe had announced that they would run for president. So they were never able to get on the stage. We've now seen that 20 that were on the stage, it's now been down to 11 that have been able to qualify. And so we can see that the threshold has not increased too much, but it's been pretty demanding for some candidates and not been able to meet that threshold. So again, this is not the media making this decision. This is the Democrat Party, but it is the media's decision to decide how they will cover candidates that did not meet this threshold. And the threshold will be even more demanding for the November debate. Also, we can see in the media the role of the muckraker, investigative journalism. And this is an interesting question about the morality of the media. So should the media be always straightforward when they're trying to get a story and upfront about it? If that was the case, the argument has been made that we never would have had improvements within the preparation of food in the United States. So there were reporters, for example, that went undercover and lied about what they were doing to report on what was life like in major slaughterhouses. Now, before we had then a lot of technology for the preparation of meat, you would have had just rows of men that would have been involved with sharp knives to prepare meat, carcasses of cattle, and now turning them into steaks and other cuts of meat. And it would have required a lot of work and a lot of danger in the process. Anytime you have large amounts of weight with the carcasses of the cows and lots of men standing around for long hours with sharp knives in their hands, you've got to think that there's opportunities for some injuries for sure. And so that's what investigative journalism would look into on the whole process of food preparation. And the same thing can be said about going undercover to find out what was life like in many apartments in major cities throughout the United States. How healthy was it? Were there opportunities for people to escape if there were fires? Many questions like that. So again, you would have had people talking to the landlords of apartments and not being fully honest as to what they were seeking when they would go in to find out about a tenement apartment. They would go undercover. They would lie about their role and what they were doing. Is that necessary to get a story, to change the behavior? Do you have to be honest all the time, or are there times in which there has to be some level of dishonesty? And we see that today. If you've ever watched the program To Catch a Predator, they're not being honest. Certainly the individuals who are wanting to have sexual relations with 13, 14-year-old girls or boys are not being honest. But those who are posing as a 13 or 14-year-old girl or boy, they're not being honest as well. But is that necessary in order to catch these individuals who are doing some very disruptive things to our society? And so that's a really, I think, very powerful question for you to consider. When is it a good opportunity to not be honest in that situation? So we still have modern day muckrakers. Well, one of the best books that was written about life and it was a novel, but it was based upon some undercover reporting within the meat packing industry. It's a book called The Jungle. Maybe some of you have read that. I would think some of you perhaps have, or you're aware of it. It's very good book, and it's very worthwhile to read. And it did change the behavior in this country, the laws in this country. Not so much improving the lives of the meat packers, which is what Upton Sinclair had hoped would happen, but instead, and that's the author of the book, it did change government regulations of the meat packing industry. Well, a couple of other issues here to look at for the media and the power of the media. One is what's referred to as the television hypothesis. And it's the argument that the more people watch TV, actually the less they know about public affairs. So it creates this belief that television actually rots the brain. You probably have heard that before. Causes people to be just less inspired. But one of the arguments about this, and that's a prediction, a hypothesis, is that it's not so much how much TV people watch, although clearly if you're watching more TV, you're more than likely unable to do other things. And so therefore you should perhaps balance out your TV watching with other activities. But nevertheless, if somebody is watching 8 or 10 hours of television straight, let's say, what is it that they're watching? Could it be that they could watch some programs that actually may improve their knowledge of public affairs? And one of the major criticisms of this television hypothesis, it's not so much the amount of TV watching, it's the type of TV watching. So if you were watching a great documentary on the History Channel, or if you were watching campaigning and government activities on C-SPAN, perhaps a person could be watching 8 to 10 hours of that and be actually a very knowledgeable person, not less informed, but one of the most informed people out there as a result of that. So some of the complaints there of that whole question of the television hypothesis. Some terms that you can see here in your text: framing, the power of the media to influence how events and issues are interpreted. So how they frame a particular issue, the media, and we see here the power of the media again can really cause us to look at particular events in certain ways. So when you look at healthcare debates, what kind of words are being used in the channels and the news blogs that you're referencing? Do they call it healthcare reform, healthcare rationing, death panels? You can imagine that the type of language that's being used is going to have an impact on how you view something like the Affordable Care Act. So how they frame that, and we can see that there are differences from one news organization to the next. We can also see that the media primes the public, gets the public ready for a particular event. And so if we're seeing events that are covering a political actor in a certain way, is it trying to prepare the public for some sort of change in policy, such as what we saw with the coverage of Saddam Hussein in Iraq? And are we now seeing that with the coverage of political leaders in Iran? And so there you see Hussein in the upper left picture, and this is the Supreme Leader Khamenei from Iran. And if you've been following the news lately, we see that we've sent troops now to Saudi Arabia, which is a country that has some very difficult relations and on the brink of war with Iran. And should that be a situation where the United States gets involved in that? And so I would urge you, as a citizen and an active political individual, which I hope many of you are, I would hope most of you are, that you start to be aware of how the coverage is being depicted of Iran, and is it trying to take us a certain direction collectively in this country to go towards another war. And media in war becomes a very big event. And how should then, once a country is at war, how should the media, a free media, cover that event? Are they there to try to help the military win the war? Or are they there to let the public know how the war is going? Those may not be the same motivations. And so there you can see a moral dilemma. What is the greater morality, to report the truth or support the country? What a reporter may be faced with. And what we did see in Vietnam is that the longer the United States was in Vietnam, the more critical the media would be of military activities. So like the My Lai massacre, and which you had some reporting of this that was pretty critical of the military. But what is the job of the military? So early on in the Vietnam War, the military was very supportive of the media, was very supportive of the military activities. Longer off, more critical. And perhaps we can also measure the war in Afghanistan with a similar type of reporting in that case. But overall, what is the responsibility, which we started this whole coverage? What is the responsibility of the media? And that ends us here with agenda setting, that there's also the power of the media to set the agenda for key events and bring the public to a certain level of attention on particular issues and problems that we can see in our society. A lot of power there for the media, and we will now turn our attention to Chapter 8 on voting behavior.